my good friend, Ambassador Susan Schwab. Couldn't be more pleased to welcome you back, Ambassador Schwab, America's 15th United States Trade Representative. Susan, you have been so generous with your time with WITA, and we're delighted to welcome you back. Thank you. We're also delighted to welcome today's panel, and I'm so very grateful to the ambassadors for joining us. Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, the EU Ambassador to the United States of America, who has also been quite gracious with his time to WITA over the years, and we're incredibly grateful to have him back with us again this year. We'd also like to welcome two newcomers to the WITA stage, Ambassador Kirsten Hillman, Canada's Ambassador to the United States, and Ambassador Tomita Koji, Japan's Ambassador to the United States. Welcome. We are honored to host all of you. Before I turn it over to Susan, though, I'd like to welcome some of the guests that we have in the audience today, which is one of the traditions we do here to tell people who they're in community with. So welcome today to Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos, Australia's Ambassador to the United States, who is joining us on the Zoom. Jean Simard, the President of the Aluminum Association of Canada. Nelson Cunningham, the President of McClarty Associates. And Akio Fuji, the Chair of the Editorial Board at Nikkei. So welcome, Arthur, Jean, Nelson, and Akio. Thank you all for joining us today. The theme for today's session is working with allies and partners, and we couldn't be more thrilled than to have you join us here today. Susan?
Thank you very much, Ken. Welcome. This is, as you said, our working with friends, allies, trading partners. Delighted to have you all here. And I am going to launch directly into questions. I'm going to start with Ambassador Lambrinidis, who is an old pro at this WITA program, and start with questions for you. And let me start with sort of the obvious question about the state of EU-US trade relations, particularly in the context of changes in leadership. The Trump administration to the Biden administration, changes in leadership in member states in the EU, particularly Angela Merkel's departure in Germany. Be interested in your thoughts. I think you're on mute.
There you go. Thanks, Susan. And thanks to WITA for having me with you again. And I apologize for the glare in the back. There's a sun that is setting behind my head, but I hope that's not dramatically bad. Look, yes, governments come and go, but there are some realities of the EU-US trade partnership and investment partnership that simply don't change. We are each other's biggest trade and investment partners by far. This is a relationship that represents about 42% of world GDP and 42% of world trade in goods and services. It's also perhaps the world's biggest economic artery when it comes to looking at the economic growth of the world itself. And as we're coming out of COVID, that's huge. And finally, I should say something else that hasn't changed is that it's a values-based relationship. And this is coming up as the intersection between trade, technology, security, values comes into the fore in our discussions. Now, with the Biden administration, we've done something quite important. We've taken the drama out of this relationship, which is actually not bad. I do not have to go around this country anymore and explain to people why Europe is not the enemy. But indeed, what we have to do now is to both of us turn our aspirations into some concrete results. So our discussions, including the Trade and Technology Council, cannot be the place where hope goes to die. It has to be the place where, in fact, real things happen. So when it comes to real things, let me close with this. So we've become much more boring when it comes to trade disputes, and that's a very good thing. And we've become much more exciting when it comes to our cooperation. In the trade dispute area, we've managed to land perhaps the longest standing dispute in WTO history, Airbus and Boeing. And that means we eliminated billions over billions of dollars and euros of tariffs against each other. That's a great thing. We've also found a temporary solution to the steel and aluminum dispute. And we are discussing, as we speak, a a global arrangement for sustainable steel aluminum. So bringing in the very important climate agenda when it comes to the trade in the steel aluminum. We've also managed to deal with our disagreements in the digital services taxes. So that's boring. Sometimes boring is nice. Certainly in trade, boring is nice. Certainly for me, boring is nice when it comes to this. But exciting is also nice, but there's no rest for the weary. And that's where the big agenda on the Trade and Technology Council has come in. So we've decided to collaborate with each other now very concretely on everything from supply chains to artificial intelligence standard setting, to export controls and foreign direct investment screening, to indeed green technologies when it comes to trade, and to with a fundamental aim, and that's to increase even further the trade between us, increase even further research and development, make sure that as we open up after COVID, we keep markets open, and that all the natural instincts and needs in some instances to produce more internally. I mean, we saw in pharmaceuticals the problems that we had by having supply chains relying too much on others, that doesn't result either in protectionism or in a subsidy race. And these are all very, very important things because, and I close with this, because values are key. As we're developing standards for the future in artificial intelligence, we have to decide who is going to put them in place. As we're looking at creating a level playing field coming out of COVID, we have to determine what that means and why it matters. In every container, I've said this in the past, we don't just put our goods, we also put our values. Those goods are produced by respecting labor standards, by not destroying the environment. Other countries increasingly put in their containers with their goods their own values. So this cooperation is, yes, about open free trade, et cetera, et cetera. But let's not lose the big compass here. And this is that trade does build and can affect a different world, a changed world, whether it comes to protecting the environment or having tech that protects people's rights. And unless Americans and Europeans do this together, smart, someone else will do it for us. So that's the positive agenda, and I'm very excited about it, Susan.
Thank you very much, Stavros. Really appreciate it. Ambassador Hillman, welcome to the WITA Ambassadors Roundtable. Very nice to see you here. Along similar lines, actually, let me begin by asking you to give a grade to USMCA, or the Canadian version of USMCA. Grade it. You can parse it out in terms of implementation, dispute settlement, economic impact, but start with a good old-fashioned grade. I'm a professor part-time. Let's start with a grading system.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks very much for having me, and hello to my friends and colleagues there on the screen. So I'm going to give it a very good grade, but I am going to answer your question just by backing up a little bit around USMCA, because I do think that when we talk about trade relationships and we talk about sort of the health of trade relationships and efforts to improve them, to build upon them, trade agreements are but one component. And in fact, I would say they're a facilitative component, but they are just one component. So I will answer your question, and then I will get to a grade. I think it may be a grade of pass fail or pass plus. I guess what the first thing I would like to say is for Canada-US trade and Canada-US-Mexico trade, but I'll speak about Canada-US trade because that's really more squarely within my line of responsibility. A lot of attention is obviously focused on trade agreements and the USMCA and the renegotiation of the USMCA, which is pretty dramatic and in a lot of respects quite unorthodox for those of us who have been doing this kind of thing for a long time. but it is, and what came out the other side is an important and modernized agreement that I think is working better by far in many ways than it was before the renegotiation. And I think that the reason for that is that the relationship itself between the continental partners, and again, just speaking to Canada and the US, is very healthy. It was during the course of our renegotiation, and it is now. I think COVID has, like in so many aspects of our lives, COVID has put a bit of a spotlight on where we have strengths and where we have vulnerabilities in all sorts of systems within our governments, within our societies. And when it comes to the Canada-US relationship and the economic relationship itself, I think that it really demonstrated, for the most part, the strength of the relationship and some vulnerabilities. So we have, for folks on the phone who may not know all of these things off the top of their heads, we have a 9,000 kilometer border between Canada and the United States. That border in normal times has about 500,000 crossings a day and supports over $2 billion a day in bilateral trade. During COVID, we had to really, really restrict the movement on that border. It was complicated, it was unprecedented, it was a decision that was made really, really quickly, more quickly than I think I could have ever imagined a decision like that being made. And there were some bumps for sure, and there were some times where things weren't working out exactly as we would have liked to, but they were quickly rectified, and we quickly kind of got ourselves back on track to the point where, while there was a diminishment in our trade between our two countries, it was rarely more than about 5 to 7% during the entire COVID period. And in fact, in November of this year, or of last year, I guess, November of last year, we had more goods and services trade than we've ever had before between our two countries. We had the highest trade statistics that we've ever had. So I'm highlighting all of this because I think that this deep connectivity of our geography, we've got energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, people moving back and forth all the time. That is actually at the core of the economic and trading relationship. The USMCA, or CUSMA as we call it, CUSMA, is the facilitator of that. And it's a very important facilitator. It's a very important facilitator for three reasons. And this is how I would grade it, getting to your question. It's an important, we set forward to modernize the agreement. And I believe we did that in important ways. We did that by bringing it into, the 21st century with digital trade commitments. We did that in sort of wonky ways that most people don't find that interesting, but are very important for traders with respect to how our customs procedures operate and are harmonized between the three countries. And we did that, and to Stavros's point, in some areas of values. We weren't really talking very much about values and promoting values in trade and trade agreements when the NAFTA was originally negotiated. We had an environment and we had a labor, provisions, but they weren't part of the agreement and they weren't enforceable under the mechanism of the agreement. They are now in very innovative ways. We have, a diversity objectives. So we have additional small business and minority-owned business objectives. So on the modernization front, I think I would give us a very good grade. On the enforceability component, I would give us an A+, because for people who don't know this, when we set out to renegotiate the NAFTA, we were in a place where we weren't able to have binding dispute settlement under the NAFTA anymore for a variety of reasons. And now we do. And in fact, we have quite a few, 3 cases, I think, ongoing right now. Enforceability is key to keeping the relations between countries predictable and setting the conditions so businesses feel like they can take the risks and expand their trade. So I would give us a top marks on that. And people often say, "Oh, you're having disputes under the agreement. That's not a good thing." I would argue it is actually. The fact that we're having disputes that are being settled by independent arbiters. Of course, we'd rather not have disputes at all. But if we're going to have them, that we are subjecting the dispute to an independent arbitration that we have set up and we are willing to abide by, I think is a very good thing. And then thirdly, and I'll stop on this, I would also give us a good grade for revitalization, because the agreement being over, almost 25 years old, we weren't doing a lot of the things that it was set up to do in the committees, in the forward-leaning discussions that we wanted to be having. And all of that, there's new life that's been breathed into all of that. And I think that that's terrific because, again, people who work certainly in trade policy and trade negotiations and trying to solve problems between countries in the trade space know that it's the relationships between the actual human beings who are dealing with an agriculture issue or a tariff issue or a border issue. It's the relationships between those people that 9 times out of 10 are going to solve the problem. And so the degree to which we can reinforce those relationships and make sure that people have open lines of communication, I think is vitally important. Thanks.
Ambassador, let me take you just one step further beyond the U.S., Canada, Mexico relationship and ask you about Canada-U.S. relationships or Canada-U.S. working together vis-a-vis third countries at this point. Changes that you might have seen with the transition between the Trump administration to the Biden administration trade policy. Any observations you may want to offer in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that first of all, that the Biden administration is very keen to work with allies in the trade space to try and push trade policy. And by trade policy, I mean, binding international rules governing trade, push them into new frontiers, right? So I think we see that quite clearly. In their discussions about trade relations with China, in their discussions about worker-oriented trade, which is, I think, starting to be defined. I think for some of us who are working with the administration, we'd like to understand a little bit more deeply what that means. But what we know for sure is that it is again, as Stavros said, it's a values-based objective. And the administration is keen to move forward in those areas. And, and just to harken back to USMCA for a second, we have very, very ambitious labor provisions in the USMCA. And those labor provisions were negotiated in part by the Trump administration, but they were really a lot of the innovative elements that are in there came from Congress and the Democrats in Congress. There was a very bipartisan agreement by the time it actually got passed. So we have people that are working very closely with the Biden administration have been part of that process of really trying to push the limits of where these rules can go. And I think that experience takes our two countries and sort of with a shared experience of thinking about these things and makes us inclined to look outward to other countries that may be willing to and interested in seeing how far we can push that. I would say environment and trade is another area where we really should be thinking about where things can go, because I think that oftentimes countries are differentiated in the trade space through economically oriented criteria alone. And we are now, I think, quite interested in looking at considering whether products that have a certain environmental profile can be treated in the same way versus products that aren't, just like we do in labor, right? We integrate into our assessment of a product how it was made from a labor perspective. And I think that we really should be looking at how we do that from an environmental perspective. So our government and the Biden administration have that in common. I think these are a lot of ideas that we're wanting to push outward and see where we can find like-minded countries to move forward with us.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hillman. Ambassador Tomita, thank you for joining us in our WITA Ambassadors session. Welcome. And a similar question for you. I would love to hear your assessment of Japan-US trade relations. And perhaps in the context of discussing that, you could offer some observations about changes that Japan has seen in the transition between Trump administration trade policies and Biden administration trade policies, and quite frankly, the transition in leadership in Japan as well. So we welcome your presence here and look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. And before I answer a question, just let me step back and look at what I've been doing. I mean, I took up my post 1 year ago, week after the inauguration. So, I've been devoting myself to the task of developing new policy agenda with the Biden administration. And in that process, I think we are starting to discover that we need to refocus a traditional bilateral economic cooperation, which traditionally focused on the trade and investment. And the two factors I think are driving this transition. The one is, the continuing impact of the pandemic, what COVID is doing to our economy. The other thing is, the increasing concern about the future of strategic competition against authoritarian states, including China. And those two factors are brought us home to the, we've been faced with the challenge of finding economic and social resilience in a globalized world. And this challenge has taken on added significance in the face of, deepening global strategic competition. And there are a number of aspects to the changing outlook of bilateral economic cooperation. But one of the key features is it has a deeper connection with their domestic policies. And, about a week ago, Prime Minister Kishida had a video conference with the President Biden, and they discussed a number of issues. But one key takeaway from the meeting is how closely their domestic policy objectives are aligned. They use different slogans. Mr. Kishida talks about the capitalist renewal, whereas President Biden advocates building back better. But they share fundamentally the same goal of building a post-COVID economy by promoting a virtuous cycle of growth and distribution. And they also share the recognition that building a resilient and competitive economy is a key part of our efforts to face up to the strategic competition against authoritarian states. So that is why we call a new framework for bilateral economic cooperation core partnership, core being the combination of the first two letters of key objectives, competitiveness and resilience. So it aims to achieve these objectives by, for instance, increasing investment in cutting-edge areas of innovation such as IT, AI, quantum computing, by protecting sensitive supply chains, for instance, including semiconductors, and by promoting green growth through innovative environment technology. And coming back to your question, in the video conference I mentioned, the two leaders also agreed to extend our bilateral economic cooperation beyond our borders. In this regard, our two countries are stepping up the efforts toward the vision of free and open Indo-Pacific region. So upgrading the cooperation within the framework of Quad is a prime example. And following up the highly successful inaugural leaders meeting in the US last autumn, Japan is going to host the second summit meeting in the first half of this year. And we also welcome President Biden's new initiative for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And we look forward to working with our American friends to flesh out the idea. But, the strong, open, rule-based trading system underpins all the policy efforts I mentioned today. And Japan and the US need to lead the regional as well as the global efforts to maintain and strengthen this system. Well, Japan and the United States work together in developing a regional trading framework now called CPTPP. And we regret the subsequent US withdrawal from this process. And, Japan has been leading the efforts to expand the partnership while maintaining its high standard. but the strategic vision of CPTPP at its inception is a creation of an open and rule-based regional economic order with the United States at its heart. So we'll continue to engage our friends in the efforts to realize this vision. So, so that's generally what's happening in a conversation about economic cooperation. I talked about the transitionary experience in developing an agenda. But the trade policy is subject to the prevailing domestic atmosphere. And coming back to the point about TPP, we appreciate that the political atmosphere here now is not very conducive to any bold new initiative. But I think there's been growing awareness that on the part of many policymakers that active, proactive trade policies will be a very important part of the overall strategic agenda. So we are very much looking forward to deepening a conversation on all these subjects that I just raised. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ambassador Tomita. This is actually very insightful and takes me into my next line of questioning. You are very kind. I would say you're very generous in your assessment of where U.S. trade policy is going. From where I sit, it's awfully hard to identify the U.S. being actively engaged in trade negotiations. Let's rephrase that, trade liberalizing negotiations with anybody at this point. We'll see how the Indo-Pacific exercise goes without any kind of congressional involvement or authority. So to that end, I would be curious about each of your assessments about trade agreements where the U.S. is not a participant, because there are a lot of them and they are growing. And unfortunately, we are sitting on the sidelines. So why don't we start with CPTPP, and we'll start, I'm going to put my professor hat back on. Maybe you could, Ambassador Tomita or Ambassador Hillman, a grade for CPTPP or any observations about how it's going. Obviously early times, but I'd be curious about that. And then I'm going to ask about RSAP, Ambassador Tomita, just sort of heads up.
Okay, if I may bat first, I think CPP is, I think, very important, very significant initiative. And it does have a very high standard as a regional trading agreement. But unfortunately, as I said, it falls short of the original strategic vision because of the absence of the United States. So that's, I think we look forward to filling that lacuna in the coming years. But the CPTPP itself is a very much an evolving process. There has been application for new membership from China and Taiwan. And so also there will be a continued effort to upgrade a standard. But at the moment, I think CPTPP is the I think the most, you can say, most advanced regional trading agreement in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you, Ambassador Hillman. Any thoughts on CPTPP?
This is a hard topic for me because it's quite near and dear to my heart. I was Canada's chief negotiator for the TPP. So I guess a couple of observations. The first is, the objective of the agreement was to create a partnership of countries that were straddling the Pacific, that were willing to really push the limits towards a high quality trade agreement that would be really taking, big steps towards liberalization, big steps towards openness. and then offering up, of course, benefits to each other in return. And in that regard, I think it gets full marks. I think it did a very good job. And the proof is in the pudding, because the trade among the CPTPP countries is growing steadily. The integration of our economies has been supercharged by the existence of that agreement. So in a very real sense, it achieved the economic, or is achieving, these things continue over time, but is achieving the economic objectives that we had for it. I think it also achieved the objectives, as Ambassador Tomita said, in creating a standard for the region that is significant and is attractive to other countries. And we see that by the fact that there are a number that are interested in having discussions with parties around joining. I think I too regret deeply that the US is not part of the agreement, but that doesn't mean that the US influence isn't all over it, because it is, because they were very central to negotiating that agreement. To your broader question about agreements being struck around the world and the US not being at the table, I mean, in my experience, it's always a question of timing, if I can put it that way. I think that there are times when governments are able to move forward, and there are times when they aren't. And you do need, for these kinds of commitments, you need to be sure that as a government that you're going to have the support of your constituencies back home. And so the Biden administration is making the decisions that they're making based on their assessment of their domestic context and priorities. But I don't think that means that the US isn't having influence on the international trading environment. They are. And that kind of gets back to my earlier point. Trade agreements are very, very important in international trade. They're platforms, and they're rules that keep us honest from one administration to the next, or one government to the next. And they're an enforcement mechanism. But they're not the only thing that's going on. So I would say that to put into context the way in which this administration is operating in the trade space. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hillman. Ambassador Tomita, do you want to just mention anything about RSAP?
Well, how you grade RSAP? I think it depends on what sort of measurement you're going to use. I mean, in terms of the standard of the agreement, is not as high as the CPTPP, but RSAP, as a framework, covers 30% of the world population, world GDP, and world trade volume. So it's a very building block, and creating new sort of trading framework in the world. And again, the RSAP is an evolving system, evolving process. We look forward to upgrading the standards. And also China's participation is very important. And it's a very important effort to engage China in the efforts to make progress in promoting open and rule-based trading practice in the region. So, in terms of standard, they're not as high as the CPTPP, but it does have its significance in its sheer magnitude, also with the inclusion of China.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Lambrinidis, can I get you to say something about the EU-China investment agreement?
Well, it's an agreement that at this stage has to go through the whole process of the European Parliament, and China has managed to do everything possible to ensure that process is not running fast anytime soon. But it's an agreement that was intended to achieve exactly what it did. It was negotiated for a very long time. It was not going to resolve every major issue in China's economy, which and there are many, and they're difficult, and they're being addressed, including through the European Union's own trade defense instruments that have gotten stronger in the past couple of years, whether it is in 5Gs and Huawei's, or whether it is in promoting our own procurement instrument to ensure that if you don't open your market to EU companies, to procure, you will not find an open market in the EU. But the agreement itself ensured both greater access to investment to our companies with much greater protections. In some ways, it did contain some elements in that sense, including when it came to forced technology transfers and all that stuff that the phase one deal had, in theory, that the US negotiated. We opened up areas of the Chinese market in EU investment with protection of those investments that didn't exist in the past. And what we did for the first time, and it was the only investment agreement that's done this with China up to now, was to ensure that we also touch on issues like labor rights and environment. So China commits in this process to ratify eventually the ILO conventions and to get into a very serious process of doing so, for that to have our agreement ratified, and also, of course, to apply all its commitments under Paris. So it was comprehensive. It didn't touch on everything, but it was quite important. On your broader question, Susan, if I may, I think I would like to agree with something that you said, I think about a year ago or so, which is that that Biden will not go to trade policy. Trade policy will come to Biden and to the Biden administration. In some ways, we do see this. You don't see an administration that is active in trying to negotiate trade agreements. I have to say the European Union is extremely pleased and proud for the supremely high standard trade agreements we have with Canada and with Japan. These are bringing tremendous benefits to consumers and to businesses and to citizens on both sides, and they're also multiplying through their standards the effects that they have throughout the regions in which we operate. But there is an emphasis in the administration today, and I think it's absolutely understandable. We have the same emphasis in Europe on ensuring that trade agreements, promote worker rights and promote consumer rights and promote lower prices and all those things, which free and open trade, which is something the US and the EU have stood by historically for decades, and we have succeeded in, to make sure that that is the rule of the road for the 21st century. The domestic emphasis of the US administration to a so-called worker-centric trade policy, to more domestic manufacturing, to dealing with more aggressively the Chinese practices. All this is, like I said, partly what we also focus on, but we always try to do our work while ensuring that we focus on the WTO. And if you want an international negotiation that needs to happen, is WTO. Kirsten mentioned before how proud she is about the enforcement elements of the USMCA. But in fact, we do not have a dispute resolution, a mechanism in the WTO for a very long time now, because of the non-appointment of judges, because of US objections. So of course we need to reform the WTO, but if you don't like the rules, you don't kill the referee. You fix the rules, and certainly we need a referee out there, or an umpire, to use a more US phrase. You need that because otherwise you have chaos, and the people with the biggest economic guns can try to enforce their views on the rest of the world, and that's not okay. So I would focus on WTO with the US administration, and I also do focus, I know Kirsten as well as doing so, on elements of trade policy domestically that we feel as Europeans run afoul of WTO rules and fair trade. And a classic example of this is electric vehicles. And I want to raise this because this is very important for us. There are provisions in the Build Back Better bill that, of course, we will see where it goes in Congress. But there are provisions that do the very, very right thing, they have a very, very correct incentive, which is to try to incentivize the use of electric vehicles as we are trying to move from polluting and from carbon emissions. But they're done in a way that fundamentally incentivize only US production of cars and only particular cars produced in particular plants. And if you look at the amounts of incentives given to consumers to buy those cars, that amounts to more than, in a sense, a 30% tariff against European cars coming into the US or against EU manufacturers in the US. So we've been very active with Congress and with the US administration saying, as we build back better, all of us, after COVID, we have to make sure that we do not undermine the international legal system on trade. We need it. We need it, especially when there are countries out there trying to undermine it for ideological reasons and other reasons. And then we also do not undermine a collective economic strength. So this is, if you like, something that I'd like to mention. Final point I want to say, Susan, when it comes to the Biden administration, I am very pleased that we are focusing on a broader topic that includes trade and investment in it more than anything else, which is coordinating and cooperating on connectivity. There are trillions of investments out there in the world today, whether it is in digital or whether it is in green or whether it is in building a hospital or building a road or a bridge. And those investments have to be done in a level playing field. We have to identify as Europeans and Americans how we can support our companies to be able to compete fairly for them, so they're not washed away by massively subsidized Chinese or other companies that are bidding for them at low prices. But there are also a lot of geostrategically important investments out there that have to be secure. And when you look at the Build Back Better world, which is what the Biden administration is doing now for connectivity, when you look at the global gateway, which is what the EU does for connectivity, and when you look at the collective power of our two economies to support that kind of investment and financing around the world, I just thought it was a huge lost opportunity the past few years that we were not working together. And I'm glad that we are now.
Wow, Stavros, thank you. That was a very nice commentary. I agreed with a lot of what you said.
Especially when I quoted you, I'm sure.
Although I'm not, yeah, well, that's, although I am not on this panel, I would just offer, I can't help myself. I have to offer two observations. One is, you're right about the umpire, as long as the umpire is even-handed and unbiased. The other thing I would note, as someone whose father worked for the ILO for more than a decade, Syria is a signatory to the 8 principal ILO conventions. So there is more to those sets of issues and value, including values in trade agreements.
Oh, hey, look, I fully agree with you. I hope no one in this panel thinks that Europe is naive when it comes to trade. We're actually doing quite good with it. So it's not what you sign, but you have to bring China into the fold, and you have to keep it to commitments, and you have to have at least the instruments to try to do so. Now, China may very well try to wiggle out of all that stuff, and we know that it has in the past. But I can either throw my hands up and never try to bring that rule book and throw it on a Chinese desk, or I can do what we have done, which is to say, okay, now for the first time you commit to the ILO conventions, which you haven't done ever before as China, really. I don't know what Syria has done. And then we start working together to see how you apply them. So I'm happy to be able to do that, although I am, like I said, I don't mean to kumbaya my way through this. It's not going to be easy, and we know it.
Appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to now go to a set of questions briefly on the WTO. You moved us into that area, and then just heads up, looking at the questions from our audience. There are a couple questions that have come in about the US-EU agreement on steel and where Japan is and how Japan should figure in that. And I will be interested in your comments on that. But before we do that, let's go to the WTO and MC12. Angela Ellard had some really interesting comments earlier today about WTO reforms applicable to dispute settlement. Stavros, as you were commenting, to negotiations, to monitoring. We're looking toward someday the next ministerial conference with some with trepidation, some with skepticism, some with optimism. And I would be interested in your assessment, Ambassador Hillman. Where do you show up on that continuum, and what would be, for example, your top 2 or 3 priorities for that engagement? What would make you optimistic? What would make you pessimistic?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I actually think it makes a lot of sense that there's a mix of enthusiasm, optimism, and pessimism, because it is a very large organization that, that houses members coming from very different perspectives with a variety of different priorities, often, well, sometimes competing priorities. So that seems a fairly natural in an organization of that nature. I think that if we just to speak about priorities quickly, I think that coming out of COVID, or not maybe coming out, but hopefully on the downside of COVID, like many things, I think we should be seeing how our organizations and our partnerships helped contribute to success, or will contribute to the next stages of fighting this pandemic, and what they can do to assist us in moving forward, maybe where they fell short. I think that we should be looking actually at all of our institutions, both domestically and internationally, and seeing what kind of lessons that we should be learning and what kind of role they can play. So trade and health, I think, is a very, very important discussion, because we all know that this virus is not being lived in the same way across the globe. I think that there are some smaller initiatives that are of interest to members. I think that there are ways to move forward initiatives that may not have the approval of all of the membership, and we should look to do that where we can. Canada did some interesting things in our Ottawa group on a few different issues, including trade and health and some trade and environment issues. Obviously, the fisheries agreement, I think that's an agreement where we should really see what we can do. And I think a success in an area like that might give a bit of a catalyst. And then there are bigger, more thorny issues that are going to take a long time. And maybe that's where people feel some pessimism. I don't think pessimism is probably that constructive. So hopefully with a bit of success, it can catalyze a bit of movement in the areas that are thornier, and dispute settlement is clearly one of the most difficult. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else on the ministerial WTO going forward, or can I turn to the sticky steel question? Ambassador Tomita, would you like to say anything about that?
Well, first on WTO, I think we take very seriously the challenge, not just because of the frustration of the member countries, we all feeling about frustration, the lack of progress. But, what's happening in WTO has led to the erosion of public confidence in a multilateral trading system. So that's, the far greater danger I think we have to deal with. And, I don't have any specific prescription, but I agree a lot of things said by our Canadian ambassador. Reform of WTO is very, very, very important. And also, I think WTO needs a success story to get things done, to prove efficacy of the organization. So, in any area, for instance, there's critical mass developing in the area of electronic commerce. Again, that might be one area we should be looking at. So, we very much look forward to achieving some sort of success in a very near future, so that we can start regaining public confidence in the whole system. And back to the steel, we are Japan was one of the few countries which didn't introduce retaliatory measures when the previous administration, resorted to the 232. So we are not too happy when the administration prioritized discussion with the EU. We have accelerated our discussions. There's been robust negotiation taking place, including ministerial level. And I don't think I should be going into specific details, but there's a template of the agreement between the US and the EU. So I think that is a basis on which we are working. And one other thing is, it's not just question of trade. I mean, we need to address the underlying issues, impacting on the trade of the steel and aluminum, which is the overcapacity. So there are areas where, of course, the two countries need to settle their difference, but also there are areas where two countries can work together to resolve the underlying problems.
If I may jump in, Susan, very quickly on the question. The first thing I would say on WTO, I'm sorry, just a second. Is it on? Yeah. The first thing I say on the WTO is that we prioritize many of the things that Kirsten and Koji mentioned, but I would say, particularly when it comes to rules reform, we very much value the trilateral cooperation we have between the US, the EU, and Japan, where we're discussing some of these issues more specifically, including new rules on subsidization of companies, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something that I think is precisely in the spirit that we're discussing. We need to be able to get an understanding, and then to be able to discuss it with other countries around the world, to be able to create the coalitions necessary to have, to have those changes. When it comes to steel, so the EU-US agreement also provides, as I said before, for a negotiation of the global arrangement on sustainable steel production. This is to say, in other words, to ensure that some of the fundamental underlying causes of the problems caused by overcapacity and why China in particular has gotten there, which is also production of dirty steel, that those issues are addressed, because as we are investing massively in the US and the EU, certainly, in climate transition and sustainable energy and technologies, we cannot afford to have carbon imported into our economies and therefore failing entirely to be able to reduce carbon emissions by countries and by producers who refuse to take similar measures. And this is precisely why we're looking at this. It's a narrow area when it comes to aluminum, but we in Europe have expanded it much larger with our process of implementing gradually what we call the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And for us, this is very important. It is WTO compatible. And we ensure that all we do is to ask countries and companies around the world to comply to what our companies and our member states do with the emissions trading system we have in Europe, which is an incentive, if you like. It's not a tax. It's not an incentive somewhere in the middle. It's an incentive for companies. It puts a price on carbon, which you need to do. And it's an incentive for companies to actually innovate in the green field, and they do. And they do all the time. And if you look at what is happening in Europe when it comes to investments of companies that fall under the emission trading scheme, you will see that they have reduced their emissions by about 45% in the past couple of decades, which is even higher than other companies and other sectors in Europe. And this is by increasing at the same time the competitiveness. So this is something that we want to work with the US as well. And it's a very interesting, very important discussion, but I have to say, I find great interest today among members of Congress and the administration to discuss how we are doing this in Europe. I'm not saying I'm seeing full agreement, and I'm not saying I'm seeing an understanding that there can be a copy-paste of what Europe does. And of course, no one should be doing a copy-paste. But I see a real interest in discussing this as opposed to a few years back.
Thank you very much. I am going to combine the last two questions in the chat and have each of you offer your final comments, because we have to bring this to a close. And they're related. One question has to do with, in your conversations on the Hill with the executive branch in particular, to what extent do you find the geopolitics and global nationalism becoming a factor in your conversations about trade policy and US trade policy? And then related to that, perhaps the conversations that you have specifically on the Hill. Stavros, you just mentioned conversations on the Hill. To what extent do you get the sense that Congress, members of Congress, are interested in engaging in trade policy discussions and trade policy negotiations even? So sort of open-ended question. We're running out of time, so limited time for answers, but I would very much appreciate each of you addressing that or those questions as we head out the door. And I will close then. I will turn to Ken once we've concluded. Who would like to go first?
Let me jump very quickly. And so geopolitics matter. Trade Technology Council is a lot about geopolitics. Even what I discussed before about connectivity is about geopolitics. But fundamentally, trade in the end of the day is about creating better lives for consumers and for businesses and for countries and for citizens. And in that sense, yes, it's not just trade agreements, as Kirsten mentioned, but in that sense, thinking about how to think of our economies, especially advanced open economies like the European Union, Canada, Japan, the US, as unified supply chains in many ways, because they do incorporate those values that we put in those containers. And to ensure that we can look at ourselves, even if we don't have a particular trade agreement connecting us necessarily, as part of the same conversation, I think that multiplies the power, the economic power of democracy, open economies in a way that we could never, ever do it alone. And that is what I hope that we can promote in the next years.
Thank you, Ambassador Hillman.
Thanks very much. I would agree. Geopolitics matter. They come into every conversation on the Hill, and I think almost all the conversations with the administration when talking about economic matters. I think that there is a desire, and I include my country in this as well. There is a desire to make sure that we are promoting in all the ways possible our core values at home and internationally. Human rights and democracy and freedom, and there are many tools in our toolkits to do that, but economic tools are certainly one of them. And that is a very live conversation, I think, not just with the United States, but with many of our partner countries around the world. And I think that your question about whether there are active trade policy discussions, I mean, again, I will come back to kind of what I've said a few times now, is trade policy discussions are not limited to discussing whether or not we should enter into negotiating a trade treaty or a sectoral agreement. The issue that Stavros raises with respect to the EV tax is a trade policy discussion, right? It's a putting in place or suggesting that having a proposal on the Hill that would put in place a tax credit that violates the WTO, that violates the USMCA, that rips apart supply chains right at the moment where we're saying we want to be making sure that we are making those more resilient with our allies and partners. That's a trade policy discussion. So those take place, even though perhaps there are fewer discussions about new multilateral or regional agreements taking place right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Ambassador Tomita.
Well, I agree. I mean, geopolitics matters. I already talked about the impact of the China in thinking about our policy agenda. But at the same time, trade and investment, free and open economic exchange across the board also matters. So we need to strike a balance between how we satisfy these sometimes conflicting objectives. So that's the area where our wisdom is going to be tested in the coming months and years. And as for the our engagement with the people on the Hill, we do find a lot of members of Congress who are interested in the trade policy, and we look forward to interacting with these members. And although I talked about a very pessimistic forecast about the U.S. possibility of coming back to TPP, but falling short of the coming back to the TPP, there are many areas where the United States can play a leadership role in the promotion of trade and investment in the region. It can be sort of rule-making efforts in the specific sector like digital trade, but you can think of other areas as well. So understanding the political constraints existing on the Hill, we continue to look forward to engaging members of Congress so that we can promote very proactive U.S. leadership in the region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Ken, over to you.
I thank you so much. I know I promised to get all of you out of here at 5 o'clock promptly, or even maybe a minute before, and I kept you now 2 minutes late. I apologize for that, but there was so much to cover. We had the idea here, the theme was working with allies and partners, which is something that the Biden administration has stressed, and we couldn't think of three better countries to have represented here. Obviously, there are others, allies and partners, and we look forward to welcoming them back in the future, but we are incredibly grateful to all of you, Ambassador Tomita, Ambassador Lambrinidis, Ambassador Hillman, and of course, our dear friend, Ambassador Susan Schwab. Thank you all very much.